You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Episode 1, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. The band of 30 cloaked figures stood on the bare hilltop, silhouetted against the great ball of the sun as it neared the western horizon. Like the tops of grain in the fields, their cloaks swayed as the chilly wind swept undaunted over the treeless crest. The silence gravitated between fear of the unknown darkness that approached and an almost holy respect for the sun as it lay down to rest beyond the trees on the far hill. As the upper rim of the sun disappeared, the old man who was considered the spiritual leader of the band turned, and the wind whipped his long white beard past his shoulder. The light from the setting sun seemed to shine from his eyes as he raised his arms and spoke. "Tanyan kunyas lemon goruskis," he said, almost as if speaking a prayer. The little band of Celts gathered around and lit the pyre just as he had commanded. The ship was cheered, the harbor cleared, merrily did we drop, below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Seamus felt refreshed. He enjoyed this new adventure on the sea. Captain Fowler had marveled at how quickly he had learned to shift his weight from foot to foot to compensate for the roll and pitch of the deck. It seemed like such a natural thing to Seamus, rhythmic and poetic. He had always been comfortable with lilting phrases. A fortnight had passed since they had weighed anchor and let the sails take their first big gulp of air. During that time they had all worked night and day, eating and sleeping whenever time permitted. The Irish lassie had tacked crosswise and at times into the wind to prevent them from being blown into the Norwegian Sea. But now the winds had shifted and were from behind. Captain Fowler had told all hands to stand down as he turned the helm over to his first mate and went below for some much-needed sleep. Seamus stood at the railing by the bowsprit with one hand on the shroud line. As his red hair blew in the wind, he watched the deep blue waters part around the graceful prow of the Snow. He had laughed when he first heard of the term of this type of ship. His new friend Kyle had explained that she was called a Snow. She had a trysail mast abaft of the mainmast, making it different from a brig, although they were all alike in most other ways. "So what do you think?" asked the voice behind him. Seamus turned to face the blonde-haired Kyle and leaned his back against the white railing, one arm extended along its rolling edge to brace himself against the gentle pitch of the ship. Kyle Owens had been talking to him during the various lulls about the town called New York with its bustle and busy air. "I'm excited to be returning," Kyle said. "I hope to find work on the wharves where I can become a rich man in a short time." "It sounds good," Seamus replied to the young man who was around his own age. "I can't imagine what it'd be like to be rich, though." He looked at Kyle for a moment before asking, "What will you do with all your money?" Kyle smiled and looked dreamily across the gently rolling waves. He was the same height as Seamus, but of sturdier build. He laid a powerful arm on the railing as he said casually, "I will buy a whole fleet. That's what I'll be doing. I'll have ships sailing from Crow's Head Cove in Ireland to Long Island Sound in New York in a steady stream. Why, they'll be passing each other going back and forth." He looked Kyle square in the eye to add as much weight as he could to his next phrase. "You can do whatever you want in America and become a wealthy man at the same time." Seamus turned back to the sea and leaned both elbows on the railing, lacing his fingers together. "I don't know if I care to become too wealthy." His mind flashed back to the sitting room in Ireland with fine paintings and tapestries on the walls. He almost feared wealth for what it did to a man's soul. "I think I just want to be comfortable." "You can have that too if it's what you want," Kyle said. "For me, that's not enough. I want to live like a prince, and I'm going to do it. You'll see." The two stood staring toward the western horizon, unbroken and empty, yet full of hope. Each saw hope in a different way, but it was the same direction for both. Finally, Kyle broke the silence. "We'd better get some rest. There's no telling how long this lull will last." "I'll be along shortly," Seamus said as Kyle made his way to the hatch. Seamus knew why he had such an aversion to becoming a wealthy man. It was all due to Lord Mayfair's attitude and his character. Did he fear becoming like him? But there was Mike Darcy, owner of the Endolock, back in his hometown of Athlone on the River Shannon. Mike could be considered wealthy, yet he knew every man in that part of County Westmeath by his first name. He treated every man he met as a friend and an equal. Then there was the captain of this very ship. Granted, Seamus had only known him for a couple of weeks, but he seemed amiable. He owned the ship outright, paid cash for the cargo, and appeared to have wealth, but he treated his crew well. They seemed to enjoy working for him. Another thought occurred to Seamus. Both men had become poor and built what they had themselves. He had heard them say so. With poor beginnings, he reasoned, they were able to feel a kinship with those less fortunate, unlike Lord Mayfair, who had been born to wealth and had never experienced a hole in his trousers. Maybe that was the key, he thought. As long as he earned his wealth and remembered where he began, he would never be like Lord Mayfair. As Seamus lowered his hand from the railing, it brushed across the jacket pocket and he felt the round bowl of a pipe. Then there were people like Jamie McPhee, the diminutive man in the woods, who had left the pipe behind. He never quite understood why Jamie had left it. Maybe he was just forgetful. If Seamus didn't know better, he would have thought the man was a leprechaun. He had given Seamus back the hope he needed when he was in his worst despair. They had been complete strangers until that unusual meeting. Then perhaps Jamie McPhee was only a waking dream. The priest at the monastery was another odd experience. What an unusual man he had been for a priest. They offset the Lord Mayfairs of the world, he thought. Those were people with noble souls who truly wished to help others. Seamus caught sight of something on the distant horizon, small yet alarming. As he watched the speck grow at a snail's pace, it seemed to take on the shape of a pile of sails, reminding him of the agonizing wait he had been forced to endure at Crow's Head Cove. Back then, when he had come to the edge of the sandy bluff overlooking the scattered thatched roofs that climbed down the slope toward the beach, he had seen a mountain of canvas entering the still blue waters of the hidden crescent. He had stopped and ducked behind a clump of hardy broomweed growing on the sand, for the Union Jack flew from the mast. At first he had wondered how the English had known to look for him there before realizing that they would not have sent a fully fitted man-of-war for one man. No, that ship had not been after him. Their prize had been more valuable. They were waiting for the illegal Whistler ships. A young lad had puffed his way up the hill and past Seamus without taking notice of him. He had watched as the lad grew smaller to the south, where a little spit of land was clearly visible. Then Seamus had descended the hill to the town. The English presence had made him nervous, but he felt that he could blend in with the townfolk well enough to escape special notice. The people of the little village at the end of Slieve Mishkish had been a bustle from the moment the canvas had been first sighted. Hoping to make himself welcome, Seamus had offered his help to the first man he saw working. The man with auburn whiskers fringing his chin had given him a quick glance, then nodded toward the pile of sacks, saying, "Take those to the back of the cottage and dump them down the chute, lad." When Seamus had returned to retrieve his own bag after dumping the last of the pile, the man had patted him on the back and said, "I see you're no stranger to work. Will you join the lads and me for a pint?" "I would be proud to," Seamus replied. "But is there no more to do?" "Nay, 'tis done, lad. Leave your bag inside the door and come with me." As they walked to the pub, the man had introduced himself as Jack and explained that the village life was centered on the whiskey trade, the smaller part being authorized by the British. Each villager played a part in the greater plan to sending the whiskey off to America, so each had a given duty in a time of need such as this. Hiding the extra grain was Jack's duty, for if the British were to find it, they would know that the village was producing far above their allotment. There were even those whose duty it is to wet the nets that are seldom used and hang them by the wharf to give us the appearance of a sleepy fishing village, he had said. "And the lad running up the path?" Seamus asked, pointing toward the hill he had descended. "What is his job?" "His task is to warn off any ships coming in. He'll cross over to the other side of Crow's Head and flash a signal by sun reflection off a mirror to stand away. When it's cloudy, he uses pennants. When it's all clear, he will flash a signal safe, and they will proceed into the cove. Father held that job before him. Seamus had been surprised by the highly organized system with which the people worked. Do you have to do this often? I mean, do the British call in frequently? Nay, hardly ever, Jack answered. But I think they were pointed in this direction this time. What do you mean? We should have had more warning of their coming, but that part of the system seems to have failed. He eyed Seamus suspiciously for a moment, then seemed to think better of it and laughed. Those fools think they will catch a whiskey ship by lying inside the cove. But they're empty coming in. It's going out that they're fully loaded. Of course, coming in empty would raise suspicion, and they would stay around to see what's being loaded, so it's best to wait either way. Seamus had laughed with him at the stupidity of the captain of the warship as they entered the pub. Even he, with no knowledge of the world, saw the lack of logic in the captain's thinking. Seamus came out of his daydream remembrance long enough to see that the speck he had been watching was only a cloud. It had been joined by others to create a line across the far horizon. Dismissing his concern with other ships, since they couldn't have any business with the Irish lassie, he turned his attention to the overcast sky. He could see that the Snow and her crew were in for some heavy weather in a few hours, so he went below for a bit of sleep. His mind drifted back to the coat. He had waited in the little village for a fortnight before the man-of-war set sail in search of other trophies. Jack had been kind in providing him with food and shelter instead of sending him off to the caves as Jamie McPhee had predicted. Of course, Seamus had earned his keep. He had mentioned Jamie's name in the pub that first day and been accepted almost as one of the villagers. He had taken his place and worked hard for his new friends in return for their kindness. There had never been any question about his reason for leaving Ireland. He had supposed they all felt that he was just one of many young men going to America in search of a better life. He had never offered any other reason, for the fewer people who knew, the fewer who could be hurt by the information. How could he have told them that there was a murderer in their midst, and it was he? They had been too kind to him to return their goodwill with the burden of that knowledge. Secrets are hard to keep, and the more people who knew them increased the risk of exposure exponentially. Eventually, the British ship had sailed in the northeast course out of the cove. Once word had been sent back from Cod's Head that she had rounded the point, the clear and safe signals had been sent off to the far side of Crow's Head. 2 sets of sails had appeared heading for the cove in a matter of hours. The sight of all that white spanking above the wooden hulls had caused a lump to form in Seamus' throat. His new fate was cast for certain, and the size of the venture lay before him in the form of those 2 small ships bobbing on the surface of the unending sea beyond. The loading of casks, both whiskey and fresh water, had taken only a few hours. The larger converted galley had no room for him, although being fully manned. But he had been welcomed aboard the little Snow called the Irish Lassie, as had been foretold him. As he had clambered aboard, he had doubts as to her ability to withstand the rough seas he had heard about because she was so small. But his doubts had been put to rest by the young man named Kyle, whom Captain Fowler had assigned to literally show him the ropes. Kyle indeed showed him the ropes and was teaching him about hope, though Seamus thought Kyle's hopes were a bit pretentious. They had quickly set sail before the man-of-war could trap them in the cove, and were plying a course for Reykjavik, Iceland, for the first of many stops for provisions, for the Snow, fully loaded, had little room left for those necessities. Below deck, Seamus had laid his head on a neatly coiled rope and pulled his jacket tight to ward off the North Atlantic chill. As his eyes closed, a smile crossed his face, for he had left his ghost behind, and he knew he would rest peacefully. He was dreaming of days gone by when he and his father would net salmon in the southern end of Loch Ree, just where it flows into the Shannon River. He could see Fahey sitting in his coracle, holding the other end of the net with himself not 30 meters away, doing the same. He could almost feel the tug of the current on the end of the net and the bobbing of his own coracle. The bobbing became fiercer. He didn't remember that. What was happening to his dream? He was being heaved about as if by some gigantic hand. His father was no longer there, and he was being pitched about unmercifully. But he held fast to the end of the net with one hand and to the coracle with the other. Until that moment the small boat had not tipped, but as a wave of extraordinary size took him aloft and dropped him, he jarred awake. The dream was gone, and he lay on his side on the deck with the coil of rope in one hand and the loose end in the other. Suddenly a heaving wave pitched him on top of the coil, and he knew it was no dream. It was the nightmare all sailors feared, a tremendous storm at sea, and he was caught below decks in its fury.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.